Thanks for the background, Olivia. Super helpful. In this new series, Little Big Shots, we're looking at the 5 shortest books in the Bible. And because they're short, there's this tendency for us to overlook them. I mean, isn't that what we tend to do in life? When something's short or small, we think, what could they say that's like deep and meaningful? Big is better. But what we're going to see, each of these 5 short books pack well above its weight and size. Though none of them are more than a chapter in length, each of these 5 short books showcases the beauty of grace. And grace is a word we love around Grace City. And these books are going to help us understand what it means to showcase grace through our lives, through our work, our relationships. And though we might feel small in a world that's changing super fast, grace punches well beyond its perceived weight and size. Today we come to the shortest book in that Paul, the apostle, wrote. And I suggest later on today you take just 3 or 4 minutes to read through the whole letter. This letter is called Philemon because that's who this letter is being written to. So let's place Philemon up here on the left. Philemon was a wealthy landowner. We know that because there was a church that met in his house, the church in Colossae. If you have a house big enough for a church to meet, you're probably in the upper echelon of society, right? We also know he's wealthy because he owned servants or slaves, and owned is the right word because that's how it was in the Roman Empire. About 1 in every 4 people were slaves owned by their masters. And that was kind of different to the slavery we know from other countries or from even our own history. It's this horrid state of affairs. In fact, when Christianity took over in the Roman Empire, by the 3rd century, slavery will get eradicated. And it's because of the teachings of Christianity, and as we're going to see, it's because of this letter that Paul wrote to Philemon that ultimately led to social transformation. So we have Philemon, but there's another character, Onesimus. Onesimus was a slave of Philemon. And Onesimus had stolen something from Philemon. So we can think of something he's got here, he's stolen, and then he does his runner from him. Perhaps he had gone away on a business trip, or perhaps he's in the cover of night, he's done this runner, he's left, and it's created this geographical separation now between where he is and where Philemon is. And so Philemon over here is obviously, quite angry about what's happening, and Philemon is also upset because he's now geographically separated. He's done the runner because of what's happened. Geographically separated, but also there's a rift between them because of what Onesimus has done. Now, somehow on the scene, Onesimus, where he is geographically, he meets up with the Apostle Paul, and they don't just meet up once or twice, but they meet up regularly, so much so that Onesimus becomes a follower of Jesus. He becomes a Christian and experiences life change. Onesimus and Paul decide that it's time for Onesimus to head back to Philemon and to put things right because, well, that's what Christians do. When they do something wrong, they steal, they run, they step in and make things right again. And so Paul writes this letter to Philemon asking Philemon to accept Onesimus, to welcome him back, to lay out the welcome mat. Now, just consider for a moment how radical this is. I mean, think about a person maybe that has wronged you along the way. You're here in the shoes perhaps of Philemon, and somebody has stolen from you, or they've shamed you in some way, and there is this wall between you. It's not a geographical wall, though it might be. It's more of a relational barrier, a separation, this emotional distance that has happened because this person has hurt you in some way. So how are we meant to respond? Well, typically there's 3 different words that can be used to describe the variety of responses when somebody has hurt us. Each of these are appropriate responses in different situations. The first is the word justice. In justice, you get what you deserve. So think of the person that's hurt you. There should be some consequences. They've stolen from you. They've shamed you in some way. They should pay for what they've done. Onesimus here is guilty of stealing, of running away. He should face the consequences. You see, justice in the Roman Empire allowed for slave owners like Philemon to execute runaway slaves and thieves like Onesimus. And if they weren't executed, typically slaves would be branded or have the letter F on their foreheads for fugitive, or tattooed CF, which was a shorthand way of saying beware of the thief. Obviously, Onesimus could have both F and CF branded on him. I can imagine the voices. Can you imagine them too? Calling for justice, calling for Philemon to bring justice on Onesimus, because otherwise, well, people would continue to do that. Slaves would run away, and the Roman Empire was built on slavery. Contemporary to this letter, we know a wealthy Roman by the name of Pendendium Sectatum was murdered by one of his 400 slaves. And during his trial, the prosecution argued that all 400 slaves should be killed as a lesson. And the prosecution won, and apparently all 400 slaves were publicly executed as an example. And I say that to give us an indication of the significant trouble that Onesimus is in. Justice demands he gets what he deserves. The second word is mercy. And mercy says, well, you don't get what you deserve. You don't face the consequences. If this is Onesimus, it would mean Philemon doesn't kill him or brand him or punish him in any way. Our mercy is this big step from justice. But grace is the third word. And grace takes an even monumentous step, because grace says you get what you don't deserve. And for the person that's heard you, it means that not only do they not get the punishment that they deserve, but they get something even better. Better treatment, hospitality, pay rise, who knows? So what do you think Paul asks Philemon to bring to Onesimus? Grace. And it's summed up right here in verse 17. He says, if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. Philemon, I want you to lay out the welcome mat for Onesimus and give him the type of welcome that you would give to a close friend like me. The word partner is used a couple of times here in this short letter. The other time is back in verse 6 where Paul says, I pray that your partnership with us in the faith may be effective in deepening your understanding of every good thing we share for the sake of Christ. Your love has given me great joy and encouragement because you, brother, have refreshed the hearts of the Lord's people. That word partnership is the Greek word koinonia. It means something like sharing together or mutual fellowship. And here in verse 6, Paul's praising Philemon for the way he shows himself to be this large-hearted, this graceful person to so many others. He's been this outstanding member in the church, and there's this real affection between Paul and Philemon. And on that basis, Paul makes this bold request. Philemon, I want you to be that large-hearted, graceful person to not just these others, but to the one person you probably don't want to show that grace to, Onesimus. If you're a true partner with me, then receive him in the same way. Receive him back not as a slave, but as a brother. Welcome him back as a social equal. To restate that verse in verse 17, if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. This is radical. Again, think of somebody who's hurt you in the past. How would you respond to this plea? If it were me, I think I'd be saying, well, this is so unfair. Do you know how that person's robbed me, how they've shamed me? But you see, grace goes beyond what's fair and right. You see, if we're honest, we don't tend to see much grace in our day-to-day lives. We're more familiar with justice and fairness. We grow up with the concept of fairness. Early on, kids say things like, it's not fair. To which our parents normally said, well, life's not fair. We expect fairness, but we're surprised by grace. And here Paul pleads with Philemon to bring grace. And the surprising, stunning reality is that this will actually place Onesimus in a much better place than if Onesimus had never done anything wrong in the first place. So Paul writes in verse 10, I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, who became my son while I was in chains. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become useful to both you and to me. And there's a play of words here. The name Onesimus actually means useful. So Paul's saying, he wasn't living up to his name before. He was actually quite useless. But now that he knows Jesus, he's become incredibly useful to both me and to you. He's serving so freely and so diligently. So he continues here in verse 12. Paul says, I'm sending him, Onesimus, who is my very heart, back to you. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He's very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord. For Onesimus, this is actually placing him in a better position than if none of this had ever happened. He's no longer a slave, but a brother. He's no longer facing justice, but being treated as a fellow partner. No longer rejected as a thief or a runaway, but he's now been welcomed as a dear friend. So why should Philemon do what Paul's asking him to do? Well, because this is the type of grace that Philemon received from Jesus himself. It's the grace we've received, and it's the grace we are to share with others. You see, Paul had introduced Philemon to Jesus. At one point, Philemon had actually been over this side of the equation. He was a wrongdoer with a list of wrongdoing that he had done between Philemon and God on the other side. But God took the initiative to send Jesus to deal with all of the wrongdoing. Jesus stepped in as mediator and brought the two parties together. That grace was offered to Philemon, and Philemon received that grace, and it transformed him. And it's this grace that transforms our status. It absorbs our debt. It welcomes us into the family of God. And through that grace, God adopted us into his own family and makes us an heir of all that Jesus has. And we're actually in a better situation now than if we had never done anything wrong as well. See, if the welcome mat of grace has been laid out to us, surely we should lay that same welcome mat to other people. The grace we've received is the grace we are to share with others. So what did Philemon do? Well, we're not told how Philemon responded to the letter, but church history fills in the gap. It seems that Philemon likely sent Onesimus back to Paul to help him. And Onesimus developed into a great leader. So 50 years later, when Ignatius, who's one of the famous Christian martyrs, he's been transported from Antioch to Rome for execution. And he writes to various church leaders. So in his letter to the church in Ephesus, he's praising a certain bishop there. And guess what his name is? Bishop Onesimus. And Ignatius even makes that same wordplay, calling Onesimus out of his name, saying, you've been so useful to me, brother. Thank you. It looks like Onesimus has become one of the great bishops in church history. And it all happened because Philemon laid out a welcome mat to welcome Onesimus. So it's only grace that has that kind of power to transform relationships. Now, justice asks for consequences, but that doesn't transform relationships. Mercy does away with the consequences, but again, it doesn't welcome anybody in. It doesn't bring people into relationship. It doesn't extend the welcome mat. It's only grace that actually has the power to transform the way we relate. You see, our big idea today is that grace lays out a welcome mat. And this changes the way we relate to each other. It was grace that laid out the welcome mat to you and me. And it's now grace that Philemon extended to Onesimus. You see, grace transforms the way we relate. But this grace goes even further. You see, grace transforms relationships across all of society. I find it really interesting that Paul does not directly attack the institution of slavery, but he does undermine it in this letter. You see, when Paul asked Philemon to receive Onesimus back, not as a slave, but as a brother, and he asked Philemon to share the letter with the entire church, he's actually overturning the values of Greco-Roman society. You see, social structures that are opposed to the gospel they're able to be replaced by new healthy relationships of love and respect at every level of human relationships. So this letter to Philemon was actually sent along with another letter called Colossians. You might remember we went through that series late last year in our navigation series. You might remember that cringe-worthy Get Real reality TV show. Probably still trying to forget about that. Well, in the letter to Philemon really is a demonstration of something Paul talks about over in Colossians chapter 3, verse 11. He says, here there's no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. See, Paul's trying to highlight these huge contrasts between Greeks and Jews, the ethnic diversity. But between slave owners and slaves, these social divisions, barbarians who didn't even know the Greek language is how they got their name. They always sounded like they were just saying things like ba, 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 ba. So they were called barbarians. The Scythians were these undisciplined people. And if you didn't self-identify with the barbarians or Scythians, well, you certainly didn't want them around in your circle. But Paul's saying, actually, the grace of God transforms our relationships. It transforms racial barriers. So there's no barrier between Greek and Jew. It transforms religious barriers. So there's no distinction between circumcised and uncircumcised or social barriers between slave or free. There's no blue collar or white collar. No Presbyterian or Pentecostal. No Asian or Pacifica, no Māori or Pākehā. There's no city professional or urban hipster, no high school dropout or high school ducks. There's no vaccinated or unvaccinated. Or I vote red or I vote blue. Rather, Christ is all and is in all. Jesus is the main thing that brings us together. This is the beauty of grace. It's the way grace lays out a welcome mat that transforms the way we relate to each other. I want you to notice too here the way grace transforms the way we engage. Do you notice here in the letter the way grace is so evident in the way Paul writes and communicates? I think this letter, it's a model of communication. Paul doesn't demand, instead he actually says here, he says, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do, yet I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. See, Paul doesn't use his power or authority or position as an apostle. He doesn't demand. In fact, when you read the whole letter, you'll notice the way he's incredibly persuasive as he writes. He's not afraid to lay it on thick. I'm an old man, my back hurts. Effectively he's saying, I'm in prison, but don't let any of that influence your decision, Philemon. I love the way he writes and he pleads on the basis of relationship and of grace, not demand. And it's the way Paul ministered throughout his life. For much of the time he was in chains. He's under lockdown in Rome. And not once does he call the believers to rise up, to take a stand, to resist the authorities. Instead, he humbly served. He always points to the way of grace, the way of Jesus. Because Paul knows that grace packs a punch well above its perceived weight and size. Effectively, Paul is placing himself in the middle here as a mediator between these two men. In some ways, he's standing in the shoes of Jesus. What Paul does is he places himself right in the gap and he mediates. He takes on the way of Jesus, the way of the cross, right in his own life. So he can say to Philemon, look, if Onesimus has wronged you in any way, if he owes you anything, charge it to me, he says. And then Paul grabs the pen from his secretary and effectively he writes this IOU in verse 19. I, Paul, I am writing this with my own hand. I will pay it back. Not to mention me, you owe me your own soul. See, Paul's standing in the awkward gap between these two and saying, charge it to me. I'll absorb the cost. Isn't that what Jesus did for you and me? You see, this is the way of Jesus. It's the way of the cross. It's the way of grace. So as I reflect on this today, I think there's three implications, three questions I'd like us to grapple with in the awkwardness of relationships and the hurts that come our way. First question, have you received the surprising grace of God in your own life? It was only when Philemon and Onesimus responded to that welcome mat that God laid out to them that they experienced that transforming power of grace in their own lives. And that's what affected their relationship to each other. And that journey begins with a simple prayer that effectively says yes to Jesus. It's like receiving an invite from someone, and you have to respond to that invite in your own words and your own ways. And if you haven't responded to that grace, you can do so right now by simply saying yes to Jesus in your own words. And you can do it now. And if you do that, we would love to talk with you. And you can type the word yes into the chat space, and one of our team will continue to chat with you in a private chat space. If you're watching, of course, on demand, just contact us, email us at help@gracecity.nz, and we'd love to send you a starting pack to help you in your newfound faith. A second question, in what practical way might you lay out the welcome mat to another person this week? There's a whole bunch of divisions happening across society right now, a lot of hurt, a whole bunch of anger. How can you lay out the welcome mat to somebody else? How might the grace that you've received affect the way it transforms your relationship and can transform the conversations around you? Which leads to the final question. How might the way you converse with others be seasoned with grace? How might your conversations change by the way you show grace? Did the comment you posted on social media, does it reflect the grace of Jesus? The posture that you have to that person, is it really about grace? There's moments like this in our society where people are so angry that we at Grace City can shine because of the grace we embody. Maybe you didn't realize this, but our iconic G in Grace City is actually designed to be this subtle open door. And that idea comes from this value we place on whānau. It's a place where everybody is welcome, where the door is always swung wide open. And even though the church isn't a building, it's people, our lives are meant to throw open that door so that we live out to our name of Grace City, and everything we do, we give grace to our city, grace to each other, grace to anybody and everybody at this time. Because grace lays out a welcome mat that transforms the way we relate to each other. Let's pray together. Jesus, thank you for the radical way that you accept each of us. Thank you for the radical grace that brings us into a relationship with you. May your Spirit help us to spread that grace into our relationships, that it would ripple through our wider society. May we experience that grace and the power of grace that might look so small, but that packs well above its weight and size. Thank you for this grace. May we embody this grace in our lives. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.